Hello. I thought I'd like to read some stories, or certainly one, and if this goes okay, I might read some more, depending on what takes my fancy. I'm going to read from this book, The Worst Journey in the World, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard, first of all. Now, Apsley was a very young member at the age of 24 of the Scott Antarctic expedition, part of which was the ill-fated and well-known tragic polar expedition, where they arrived to their disappointment behind Amundsen at the South Pole and then perished on their return. The title of the book, The Worst Journey in the World, refers in fact to another expedition that was part of the Antarctic expedition, where Apsley and two colleagues, Bowers and Wilson, who also actually died on the polar expedition, went in the middle of winter on a short journey of only 70 odd miles to garner some emperor penguins' eggs. The idea was to get them with developing embryos, and at the time the thinking was this would reveal key information about the development of birds from their dinosaur ancestors. And I might read some more highlights from that tomorrow or another day. But prior to all of that, the expedition set sail from England in 1910 in a rather elderly and possibly not wonderfully maintained ship called the Terra Nova, and they travelled via South Africa to New Zealand, where they stocked the ship up with what they would need for the duration of the 2 or 3 year expedition in Antarctica. And from New Zealand, with this overladen ship, they travelled to Antarctica, and on the way they met a storm, and that's what I'd like to share with you this evening. So if you'd like a bedtime story, or just like me, up late and not sleeping, I hope this is of some entertainment or interest or perspective. During this account, Apsley Cherry-Garrard shares diary accounts written by Bowers and by Wilson. Thursday, the 1st of December, we ran into a gale. We shortened sail in the afternoon to lower topsails, jib and staysail. Both wind and sea rose with great rapidity, and before the night came our deck cargo had begun to work loose. I read that badly. And before the night came, our deck cargo had begun to work loose. Come on, Apsley, more commas, please. The conditions became much worse during the night, and things were complicated for some of us by seasickness. I have lively recollections of being aloft for 2 hours in the morning watch on Friday and being sick at intervals all the time. For sheer downright misery, give me a hurricane, not too warm, the yard of a sailing ship, a wet sail, and a bout of seasickness. It must have been about this time that orders were given to clew up the jib and then to furl it. Bowers and 4 others went out on the bowsprit before being buried deep in the enormous seas every time the ship plunged her nose into them with great force. It was an education to see him lead those men out into the roaring inferno. He has left his own vivid impression of this gale in a letter home. His tendency was always to underestimate difficulties and whether the force of the wind in a blizzard or the troubles of a polar traveller. This should be remembered when reading the vivid accounts which his mother has so kindly given me permission to use. We got through the 40s with splendid speed and were just over the 50s when one of those tremendous gales got us. Our latitude was about 52 degrees south, a part of the world absolutely unfrequented by shipping of any sort, and as we had already been blown off Campbell Island, we had nothing but a clear sweep to Cape Horn to leeward. One realised then how the Nimrod, in spite of the weather, they had always the security of a big steamer to look to if things came to the worst. We were indeed alone by many hundreds of miles, and never having felt anxious about a ship before, the old whaler was to give me a new experience. In the afternoon of the beginning of the gale, I helped make fast the topgallant sails, upper topsails and foresail, and was horrified on arrival on deck to find that the heavy water we continued to ship was starting the coal bags floating in places. These, acting as battering rams, tore adrift some of my carefully stowed petrol cases and endangered the lot. I had started to make fast sail at 3 p.m. and it was 9:30 p.m. when I had finished putting on additional lashings to everything I could. So rapidly did the sea get up that one was continually afloat and swimming about. I turned in for 2 hours and lay awake hearing the crash of the seas and thinking how long those cases would stand it, till my watch came at midnight as a relief. We were under 2 lower topsails and hove to, the engines going dead slow to assist keeping head to wind. At another time I should have been easy in my mind. Now the water that came aboard was simply fearful. And the wrenching on the old ship was enough to worry any sailor called upon to fill his decks with garbage fore and aft. Still, risk nothing and do nothing. If funds could not supply another ship, then we simply had to overload the one we had, or suffer worse things down south. The watch was eventful as the shaking up got the fine coal into the bilges, and this, mixing with the oil from the engines, formed balls of coal and grease, which ordinarily went up the pumps easily. Now, however, with the great strains and hundreds of tons on deck, as she continually filled, the water started to come in too fast for the other clogged pumps to cope with. An alternative was offered to me in going faster, so as to shake up the big pump on the main engines, and this I did in spite of myself and in defiance of the first principles of seamanship. Of course, we shipped water more and more, and only to save a clean breach of the decks did I slow down again and let the water gain. My next card was to get the watch on the hand pumps as well, and these were choked too, or nearly so. Anyhow, with every pump, hand and steam going, the water continued to rise in the stokehold. At 4 a.m, all hands took in the 4 lower topsail, leaving us under a minimum of sail. The gale increased to storm force, that's force 11, out of 12 on the Beaufort scale, and such a sea got up as only the southern 50s can produce. All the afterguard turned out and the pumps were vigorously shaken up. Sickening work as only a dribble came out. We had to throw some coal overboard to clear the afterdeck round the pumps, and I set to work to rescue cases of petrol which were smashed adrift. I broke away a plank or two of the lee bulwarks to give the seas some outlet, as they were right over the level of the rail, and one was constantly on the verge of floating clean over the side with the cataract force of the backwash. I had all the swimming I wanted that day. Every case I rescued was put on the weather side of the poop to help us get a more even keel. She sagged horribly, and the unfortunate ponies, though under cover, were so jerked about that the weather ones, that's the one nearest the wind, could not keep their feet in their stalls, so great was the slope and the strain on the forelegs. Oates and Atkinson worked among them like Trojans, but morning saw the death of one and the loss of one dog overboard. The dogs, made fast on deck, were washed to and fro, chained by the neck and often submerged for a considerable time. Though we did everything in our power to get them up as high as possible, the sea went everywhere. The wardroom was a swamp, and so were our bunks with all our nice clothing, books, etc. However, of this we cared little, when the water had crept up to the furnaces and put the fires out, and we realised for the first time that the ship had met her match and was slowly filling. Without a pump to suck, we started the forlorn hope of buckets and began to bail her out. Had we been able to open a hatch, we could have cleared the main pump well at once, but with those appalling seas literally covering her, it would have meant less than 10 minutes to float had we uncovered a hatch. The chief engineer, Williams, and carpenter, Davies, after we had put all our heads together, started cutting a hole in the engine room bulkhead to enable us to get into the pump well from the engine room. It was iron and therefore at least a 12-hour job. Captain Scott was simply splendid. He might have been at Cowes. And to do him and Teddy Evans credit, at our worst strait, none of our landsmen who were working so hard knew how serious things were. Captain Scott said to me quietly, "I'm afraid it's a bad business for us. What do you think?" I said we were by no means dead yet, though at that moment Oates, at peril of his life, got aft to report another horse dead and more down. And then an awful sea swept away our lee bulwarks clean between the fore and main riggings. Only our chain lashings saved the lee motor sledge, and then I was soon diving after petrol cases. Captain Scott calmly told me that they did not matter. This was our great project for getting to the pole, the much advertised motor sledges that did not matter. Our dogs looked finished and horses were finishing, and I went to bail with a strenuous prayer in my heart and yippee-i-addy on my lips, and so we pulled through that day. We sang and re-sang every silly song we ever knew, and then everybody in the ship later on was put on 2-hour reliefs to bail, and it was impossible for flesh to keep heart with no food or rest. Even the freshwater pump had gone wrong, so we drank neat lime juice or anything that came along and sat in our saturated state awaiting our next spell. My dressing gown was my great comfort, as it was not very wet, and it is a lovely warm thing. To make a long yarn short, we found later in that day that the terrible storm was easing a bit, and that though there was a terrible lot of water in the ship, which, try as we could not reduce, it had certainly ceased to rise to any great extent. We had reason to hope then that we might keep her afloat till the pump wells could be cleared. Had the storm lasted another day, God knows what our state would have been if we had been above water at all. You cannot imagine how utterly helpless we felt in such a sea with a tiny ship. The great expedition, with all its hopes thrown aside for its life. God had shown us the weakness of man's hand, and it was enough for the best of us. The people who had been made such a lot of lately, the whole scene was one of pathos, really. However, at 11 p.m, Evans and I, with the carpenter, were able to crawl through a tiny hole in the bulkhead, burrow over the coal to the pump well cofferdam, where, another hole having been easily made in the wood, we got down below with Davy lamps and set to work. The water was so deep you had to continually dive to get your hand onto the suction. After 2 hours or so, it was cleared for the time being, and the pumps worked merrily. I went in again at 4:30 a.m. and had another lap at clearing it. Not till the afternoon of the following day, though, did we see the last of the water and the last of the great gale. During the time the pumps were working, we continued the bailing till the water got below the furnaces. As soon as we could light up, we did, and got the other pumps under way, and, once the ship was empty, clearing away the suction was a simple matter. I was pleased to find that, after all, I had only lost about 100 gallons of the petrol, and, bad as things had been, they might have been worse. You will ask where all the water came from, seeing our forward leak had been stopped. Thank God we did not have that to cope with as well. The water came chiefly through the deck, where the tremendous strain, not only of the deck load, but of the smashing seas, was beyond conception. She was caught at a tremendous disadvantage, and we were dependent for our lives on each plank standing its own strain. Had one gone, we would all have gone, and the great anxiety was not so much the existing water as what was going to open up if the storm continued. We might have dumped the deck cargo, a difficult job at best, but were too busy bailing to do anything else. That Captain Scott's account will be moderate, you may be sure. Still, take my word for it, he is one of the best, and behaved up to our best traditions at a time when his own outlook might have been the blackness of darkness. And Bowers ends his account. Under its worst conditions, this earth is a good place to live in.